Brock Purdy, Christian McCaffrey, Brandon Aiyuk, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle. The 49ers offense is absolutely loaded with elite playmakers. We discussed their 2024 fantasy outlook on today's episode of Locked
You are
On
Locked
Fantasy
On
Football.
Fantasy, your daily NFL fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm one of your co-hosts, Michelle Magdziuk. When I'm not doing this, I'm a researcher and NFL analyst. Sorry, I should say fantasy analyst with NFL Network. Vinny's still on vacation, but we have an amazing guest today. One of my very good friends, Rob Stats Guerrera. I never call you Rob, so we're just going to stick with Stats for the rest of the show. He's a producer and host at the Gold Standard Network and also a host at ESPN Radio and an absolute 49ers expert, I would say, because you grew up a 49ers fan your whole life. You've been covering the team for your career over the last 4 years. So I'm excited to dig into all these 49ers options because I would say they're probably the number one offense in terms of fantasy relevance because they have a great player at every position. Let's start right off the bat with the quarterback, Brock Purdy. Finished as the quarterback 7 in fantasy points per game last year. Do you think he has the ceiling to be an elite fantasy option in 2024?
Probably not, because when you're talking elite fantasy options at quarterback, you want a guy that can pick up yards and touchdowns on the ground. But I will say that when Brock Purdy was asked what he wants to work on for next year, he said arm strength and mobility. So I'm wondering if maybe we'll see Brock run a little bit more for the 49ers next year. I still don't think he's going to have the designed runs that some of the elite guys at the position have. So that's probably holding him back a little. But I also think that there's room for him to potentially have even more passing touchdowns in 2024.
That's what I was going to ask. So does he have the capability to put up a year that's 4,500 plus passing yards, 40 plus passing touchdowns? Because if you're not that mobile type of quarterback where you're getting 400 plus rushing yards on the ground, you kind of need those numbers to be elite fantasy option. I'm talking like top 3 quarterback. Last year, though, he puts up 31 passing touchdowns, 4,280 passing yards, both top 5 in the NFL. And he did that in only 444 pass attempts. Extremely, extremely low. To compare that, Dak Prescott had 590 pass attempts last year. Josh Allen had 579. Jared Goff had 605. So there is room there for him to have way more pass attempts. But will he on this 49ers team next year? Because are they going to go away from running it so much with CMC? Will maybe their defense gets a little bit worse? They have to pass more. Or do you see his pass attempts increasing next year?
They definitely can, because as you said, nobody threw fewer passes than the 49ers last year. 11 of their 12 wins on the season came by double digits. And the only one that didn't came against the Rams when Sean McVay kicked a meaningless field goal on the final play of the game to make that a 1-score game. So they were up big in a lot of these games. So they were running the ball, trying to shorten the game, trying to, protect the lead, basically. I don't know if the 49ers are going to be that dominant in the regular season next year. So I think they might have to rely on Brock Purdy a little bit more. So that would mean more passing attempts for him. And we know Kyle Shanahan's going to dial it up. So I think there's a distinct chance that Brock's passing numbers increase next year, especially because, too, he's going to get better as a player. This was only his second year as a starter, his first full year as a starter. So I think there is room for growth with Brock Purdy.
I know that's something that we all just ignore because he's on such a good team. And we put that for some reason. We're like, oh, we can't count anything Brock Purdy's doing because he's on a loaded team. But he had 5 starts in his rookie season, in the regular season. So last year was literally pretty much his full rookie season. And that's coming off a terrible elbow injury where he didn't even have even close to a full offseason to get better going into his second year. And he came out and he was better than his rookie season, something that we didn't think was really going to be possible with that injury. So he's been proving us wrong nonstop. I will say, the 49ers have never had a quarterback pass for 40 touchdowns, right?
No, they've never had a quarterback throw for 40 touchdowns. And Brock now has the single season passing yardage record for the 49ers.
And if Christian McCaffrey doesn't steal so many rushing touchdowns next year, automatically that should increase as well. So there is a ton of room for growth here. When you're looking at his average draft position at the quarterback position, it's hard to find this right now. It's April. So a lot of these rankings have dynasty drafts kind of messing with it as well. But right now, he's at quarterback 12 behind guys like CJ Stroud, Justin Herbert, Anthony Richardson, Jordan Love, and a decent chunk behind these guys. Do you think that's fair, or should he be right in that group? I know when you hear Justin Herbert, you hear like this top tier quarterback in the league, but like for fantasy, he's really not. I mean, Purdy has been better than him as of late.
Well, and here's the thing with Herbert, too, and I can speak from experience as a 49er fan. Jim Harbaugh is the coach of the Chargers now. He loves to run the ball. Herbert's pass attempts are going to go way down because of Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman with the Chargers, whereas I think Purdy's are going to go up, especially because Christian McCaffrey had so many touches last year. There's probably a pretty good chance he gets injured next year. And if he gets injured, Brock is going to have to pick up that slack. So that means more opportunity for Brock to put up better numbers.
Well, we don't want to put that jinx on him. So knock on wood. We don't want Christian McCaffrey to get hurt. I will say the biggest thing for me is looking at the love that CJ Stroud gets and kind of the opposite for Purdy. So right now, CJ Stroud is going to go really, really high in fantasy drafts next year, and he deserves to be. He looked really good as a rookie, and I think he's going to be good next year. And now they traded for Stephon Diggs. So his team is also loaded with Diggs and Nico Collins and Tank Dell and Joe Mixon and still Dalton Schultz. So like he has a loaded group too. But Purdy and him they were neck and neck last year. Purdy averaged 18.5 fantasy points per game. CJ Stroud averaged 18.4 fantasy points per game. So Purdy actually outscored him. And CJ Stroud was averaging 6 more pass attempts per game than Purdy last year. And yeah, it's cool and fun that Stroud looked great his first season. So did Purdy. It's great that Stroud has so many great weapons around him. So does Purdy. So I don't really understand the gap there in between their two costs. And if I get to take Purdy 4 or 5 rounds later, I'm waiting on Purdy instead of paying up for Stroud. Do you agree with me with that?
100%. I think that Purdy is the classic example of the quarterback that you can wait for in fantasy drafts and still get the production value out of. He's the guy you can draft and people will be like, I don't understand. How is this team so good? And then you look and you've got a bunch of stars at other positions and Brock Purdy is the quarterback. The reason is Brock loses the throwing competition, right? Like CJ Stroud throws a better ball than Brock Purdy. He has a stronger arm than Brock Purdy. It just looks spectacular. But from a fantasy perspective, if you gain 12 yards because CJ Stroud throws a ball on a rope outside the boundary, it makes a beautiful pass, or you gain 12 yards because Brock Purdy throws a check down to Deebo and he breaks 3 tackles, they count the same. But because it looks different with Brock, I think people undervalue the same production.
And I think I feel better about Purdy as well because CJ Stroud, amazing rookie season, right? Still only 23 passing touchdowns. So he's going to have to get that up. But for a rookie, that's a normal amount, nothing to be worried about. But we haven't seen yet how he's going to react in his second season. Once defenses have more tape on him, that's something we're worried about with Purdy. Will he get better in his second season? We already saw it with Purdy. We already know he is that type of player because now we've seen it 2 years in a row. With Stroud, we only seen it once. So I do feel better about Purdy's going to come out and be who he is, if not better. With Stroud, we don't know. Yeah, will we see a decline? Will we see an upgrade? I'm expecting an upgrade, but that's just us projecting that, right? Now, Jordan Love gets so much love. I really didn't even mean that as like a pun or anything. But as a actual NFL quarterback, I keep seeing him ranked inside the top 10. As a fantasy quarterback, he is being ranked a good chunk, like a large chunk ahead of Brock Purdy, 24 spots ahead of Brock Purdy. So 2 whole rounds ahead of him. He averaged 0.4 more fantasy points per game than Purdy last year. So yeah, outscored him slightly. A lot of that had to do with the end of the year, but his weapons don't excite me nearly like the 49ers do. And he was just hyper efficient last year. And I don't know if that's going to stick with Jordan Love.
I think if Jordan Love's going to put up numbers, it's going to be largely because he's really, really good. It's funny. The same things that people use to kind of slander Brock Purdy work in his favor, I think, from a fantasy perspective. Brock doesn't have to work as hard to get his points and get his production. It's kind of easier for Brock Purdy than it is for Jordan Love, frankly, because, Brock has the Avengers around him. So, yeah, you might think Jordan Love is going to be really, really good next year, but he's going to have to be because it's all on him. I know they have Josh Jacobs there. I don't even really care about that much. I think, frankly, that's a downgrade at running back for the Packers. But for Brock Purdy, like, just do what you do, drop back, get the ball to your people, and you're going to put up numbers. And Brock had one fewer touchdown pass than Jordan Love last year, and Jordan Love had way more attempts and played in more games than Brock Purdy last year. Again, it looks pretty with Jordan Love. He can make amazing throws, right? But that doesn't mean the production is that much better. It doesn't matter what it looks like.
Yeah, you bring up the production because of what the skill players could do for the 49ers. So the 49ers were the first team in NFL history with a running back, tight end, and multiple wide receivers, each with 1,000+ scrimmage yards in the same season. So as we brought up, this team is absolutely stacked. And we're going to get into those skill players throughout the rest of this episode. I want to start with Brandon Aiyuk versus Deebo Samuel. I want your thoughts on those guys for fantasy. And if you think Brandon Aiyuk will be on the 49ers in 2024. We'll get to all of that right after the break. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up with peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So two elite options here at wide receiver, Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel. They actually both finished as wide receiver 12 on the dot in fantasy points last year in half PPR. And then they're back-to-back rankings in ADP. Aiyuk is wide receiver 14. Deebo's wide receiver 15. Now, I know you think Aiyuk is a heads above Deebo Samuel in terms of talent as an NFL player. Do you feel that way in terms of fantasy as well?
I don't love either one in fantasy, to be honest with you. You know me, Michelle. I like guys that score touchdowns. And Brandon Aiyuk doesn't really score touchdowns, especially in crunch time last year. 5 out of the last 6 weeks, no touchdowns. That's your fantasy playoffs. If you want that guy, your top 10 guy that you draft, he's got to help put the team on his back. And Aiyuk just doesn't, or at least he doesn't do it consistently enough. Yeah, he has some big yardage games, but he has some games where he just does nothing. Kyle Shanahan does not force feed him the ball, and it really, really hurts his production. He had 6 games with no touchdowns last season, and his only game with multiple touchdowns came in week 1 against the Steelers. That can't be my top 10 wide receiver. If I can get that guy later, great. Top 10? No.
I mean, that's the issue, right? He had such a good year last year in receiving yards for 1342, was absolutely efficient, which we'll get to that in a second because I think his efficiency has to go down. But despite such a good year, he still averaged just the 16th most fantasy points per game in full PPR leagues, right? So if you play in full PPR, it's even more inconsistent. You brought up his best week was in week 1. He only had 3 finishes inside the top 10 wide receivers for weekly finishes last year. And then so many other bad finishes, wide receiver 64, 36, 33, 37. Those were all in a row. 56, 62, like a ton of weeks he's just destroying you. And the reason that is because he had 105 targets last year. He averaged just 4.7 receptions per game last year. That's the same amount as Kendrick Bourne. Like, that should not happen when you're as talented as Brandon Aiyuk. But when you're stuck in such a stacked offense with an offensive coordinator who wants to spread the ball around, it's really hard to get those consistent targets and be a good fantasy option. And then also he averaged nearly 18 yards per reception last year. His average before that, he was at 12.5, 14.8, 13.0. Like, he's likely going to come back down to his average, come back down to the mean. I don't see him being as efficient as he was last year because it's going to be really hard to do back-to-back seasons.
That's the key is this the ceiling for Brandon Aiyuk or closer to the floor? And I think it's closer to the ceiling, to be honest with you. I can't imagine somebody being more efficient than Aiyuk was last season. And I think that the 49ers kind of realize now, like, the Deebo thing is kind of over. Like Aiyuk should be their main guy. He should have been the guy they focused on more in the Super Bowl. If they haven't learned it by now, they're never going to learn it. But I think they have. So I think you'll see Aiyuk get more targets next year, but I think his efficiency is going to be lower. And so I think that will kind of even out in the end. And the Brandon Aiyuk that we see is sort of the Brandon Aiyuk that we'll get.
So I am a lot higher on Deebo Samuel than you are in terms of actual NFL player. I think when he takes over games, it's special. It's special in a way that one of the top guys in the league, when he truly takes over a game, it's impossible to stop him, right? When he gets in that mindset. And I don't think we see that really ever out of Brandon Aiyuk. He can make great special plays, but taking over a game doesn't really feel like it happens too often. Now, his targets are super low. Deebo Samuel last year only had 89 targets, missed a couple games. Typically does because he's a tough runner as well. But he always scores those rushing touchdowns to help with his fantasy production. Do you think he can ever get to a fantasy season or just an NFL season like he had in 2021 ever again? Or that was just the highlight of his career?
I think that was the highlight of his career. And I don't say that to knock Deebo Samuel. I say that because that year was one of the most historic years in the history of the NFL. Look, there are very few players that did what Deebo Samuel has ever done, receiving wise and with yardage and touchdowns on the ground from that position. It's an incredible, incredible season. It happened at the perfect time for him because he cashed in with his deal. Like if he doesn't have that season, I don't know that he's still on the 49ers, honestly. And I think if you could inject Kyle Shanahan with truth serum, he would tell you he wishes he could get out of that Deebo Samuel contract right now. But he's going to be there for this year. I think Deebo is what he is. I think he's a guy that can get open when Kyle schemes him open. With the ball in his hands, he is incredible, but Kyle's got to get the ball in his hands. Deebo can't get the ball in his hands himself, and that's a scary proposition because I think you're going to see more and more teams willing to just stick their best corner on Deebo and say, we're taking him away.
Now, I think his 2021 season is a good thing to show us how hard it is to stay that efficient, right? So in 2021, Deebo Samuel averaged 18.2 yards per reception, even more than Aiyuk did in 2023. And then that came all the way down to 11.3 the following year. And then even a really good year last year, 14.9. That's a amazing year still. The 15 yards per reception you're going to take. But if Aiyuk goes down to that, you're going to see a big dip in his fantasy points unless those targets go up. So I'm with you. I don't really love either of these guys for fantasy because I think they hurt each other as well as the other players hurting, them too on this offense. But let me ask you a question. Do you think Brandon Aiyuk will get traded on draft night? Because I think if he gets traded, it'll be on draft night. And if that were to happen, then does Deebo skyrocket up fantasy boards?
I think there's a real possibility that Brandon Aiyuk gets traded. I think what happens between now and 21 days to the draft, 20 days to the draft is really important in his future. If he is dug in and firm and, he wants $28 million a year and the 49ers don't want to go that high, depending on how the board falls, I could very easily see the 49ers trading Brandon Aiyuk. I don't think it would happen until draft night because I think the 49ers would want to know who is available to them because obviously they don't pick till 31. But I think it definitely could happen, especially if Aiyuk starts to make a little noise between now and the draft, kind of like the way Deebo Samuel did. So I think that it's definitely possible he gets traded. Now, if he does, it'll be interesting to see how the 49ers respond. If they trade Aiyuk and get a first-round pick and use it to draft another receiver, that's one way they could go. If they use those picks to bolster the offensive line, or maybe they take an offensive lineman and a corner in the first round and wait to take a wide receiver, then I think that means more targets for Kittle, more targets for Deebo, more touches for Christian McCaffrey. So whether or not they end up acquiring a pick and getting a wide receiver high in the draft, I think will determine what that means for everybody else in the 49ers.
And I think that's what they should do if they were to trade Aiyuk. And now another team in the 20s really needs a wide receiver with the Buffalo Bills. So another trading option. There's a lot of trading teams here that could be looking for Aiyuk. But this class is so stacked. So I think that would be the perfect way to go for the 49ers. Bolster up your offensive line, get a corner, and then in the second, third round, you could start taking your wide receivers there because of how many good wide receivers are in this class. I do think if Aiyuk moves, I'm going to get really high on Deebo and possibly get higher on George Kittle. George Kittle is not a guy I've ever liked to roster in fantasy. Another guy in this team who's highly inconsistent with his fantasy points. The only player that has not been inconsistent is Christian McCaffrey, right? And we need to talk about he's going into his 8th season, getting a little worried that maybe this is decline because that's what happens with running backs. So I want to hear your thoughts on him. Is he still the number one player off the board for 2024 fantasy drafts? And then also, like, are you down on George Kittle like I am? I know you're a little George Kittle hater. So we'll end the show with you, being super nice to George Kittle.
First of all, you can't see it. There's a George Kittle jersey on my wall right now. So
no, you want him gone from the team. It's fine. It's fine. I want to hear your fantasy thoughts, though. We'll get to that end the show right after the break. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscriptions fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as a Q1 2024 validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC members SIPC is a registered broker dealer. I feel like there's no way that we go into the 2024 fantasy drafts and Christian McCaffrey is not the first guy off the board. But should he be? Because you just brought up in our segment earlier that you're worried he might not stay healthy all year. Do you think there's anyone that's a non-quarterback that could rival him in total fantasy points next year?
It's going to be hard because he's really good and Kyle loves to give the ball to his running backs. Like if it was up to Kyle Shanahan, he wouldn't even have any other running backs active on game day. When Christian McCaffrey is healthy, he gets every running back touch for the 49ers. He had 339 touches last year. That led the league. That is a ton. The only way he doesn't keep getting those, though, is if he gets hurt. If he is healthy, Kyle will feed him. So your faith in Christian McCaffrey, to me, is entirely dependent on whether or not you think he can stay healthy. History shows us that when NFL running backs get that many touches in a year, they usually aren't able to do it multiple times in a row, especially when they are as old as Christian McCaffrey is. So if I had to put a significant amount of money on what would happen, I think he's going to be banged up and miss time. So that's the only thing that would stop me from taking him first overall. If there was a non-running back or a non-quarterback that would outscore Christian McCaffrey, I think there's only two options. One, Bijan Robinson in Atlanta. Now that he has a real quarterback in Kirk Cousins, like people hate on Kirk Cousins, and I get it. He's a human sweater vest, but he knows how to get the ball to people. They're going to run an efficient offense. Kirk Cousins is going to put up 4,000 yards. He's going to put up 30 touchdowns, and he's going to make everybody, all the skill players on Atlanta, better. So Bijan Robinson definitely has a shot. And if I had to pick a wild card, what about Garrett Wilson with the Jets? I think Garrett Wilson is really freaking good. And you want to talk about somebody held back by his quarterbacks. I mean, it has been a disaster at quarterback for the Jets. And people forget when Aaron Rodgers is there, he gets a number one guy. He feeds that guy like crazy. We saw it with Jordan Nelson. I saw Aaron Rodgers let James Jones lead the league in touchdown passes. And when Jones left, he couldn't do anything. His career year came with Aaron Rodgers, and then his second best year in terms of touchdowns came with Aaron Rodgers when he came back to the Packers. So I think Garrett Wilson has a real shot to explode in 2024.
See, this is my thing with Garrett Wilson is I was so high on him last year coming in with Aaron Rodgers, and then I wanted him everywhere, and then Aaron Rodgers plays one drive. So
4 snaps.
Not even. Yeah. So, and then it's just sitting in my mouth, and it's not Garrett Wilson's fault, but I have a hard time there being all in again until I see that Aaron Rodgers can actually play and be there, and that the Jets could actually have a quarterback. That would be cool. Now, when it comes to anyone that got close to CMC last year in fantasy points, it was CeeDee Lamb and Tyreek Hill and nobody else in terms of fantasy points per game. CeeDee Lamb, you could see that number coming down a little bit. He got 1 gazillion targets. Tyreek Hill, though, Tyreek Hill's kind of in the Christian McCaffrey bucket, right? In terms of their positions, they're both getting kind of older. And I will say your Bijan Robinson, we talked a lot about this. I had Kate on Monday and we said, could he rival Christian McCaffrey? And she says yes. And I have said this stat now a few times this week, but I think it's crazy. So I just want to say it again for a third time. I'm sorry, listeners. Bijan Robinson had 3 carries inside the 5-yard line last year. 3 carries. To compare, Craig Reynolds and Rico Dowdle each had 4 carries inside the 5-yard line. So they had more carries than Bijan Robinson, the 8th overall pick, a monster of a dude. Gus Edwards led the league with 23 such carries. Christian McCaffrey had 18. Those are going to go up. Like, he's going to have more carries. Arthur Smith is gone. They're going to have more scoring opportunities with Kirk Cousins there. And please just stop with they will stop with Jonnu Smith getting goal line carries out of nowhere. And Cordell Patterson getting carries. So automatically that has to get better. And then we've been talking about maybe Christian McCaffrey could decline. So Fantasy Points, the website Fantasy Points, they had out this chart that shows the average year of fantasy points in terms of their percentage of career. Oh my goodness, I'm saying this very poorly. When they start to drop off in terms of fantasy points compared to their career average. And the largest chunk is from year 7 to year 8. And year 8 is where they really start to see the decline on average for fantasy points and running backs. And Christian McCaffrey is going into that 8th season. Now, year 2 is typically the best season on average for running backs, which Bijan is going into his 2nd year. Are you taking any, worry with this? Or are you just saying Christian McCaffrey is not like average running backs?
Well, if you ask Christian McCaffrey, he will tell you that. Kyle Shanahan has talked about this a lot because obviously the big fear when the 49ers traded for McCaffrey was he's been banged up his last couple of years with the Panthers. Can he stay healthy? And McCaffrey was, Kyle Shanahan says, almost like yelling at him, telling him like, the injuries that I've had have been freak injuries. They haven't been like wear and tear injuries. I'm good. Trust me. And with the 49ers, he has been good. He has been fantastic. I know he sat a couple games at the end of the year last year, but I think that was more precautionary because the 49ers had clinched, so they didn't need him. So he is adamant that like, I am good. I am taking care of myself. He's, maniacal about his body. He's a phenomenal worker, yada, 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 all the stuff everybody always says. But McCaffrey will tell you that he's different. But I have a hard time betting against NFL history. Like, NFL history is NFL history for a reason. So if you're confident that McCaffrey can be an outlier, okay. But I also think taking Bijan Robinson and at worst ending up with probably the number 2 running back in fantasy, who's a much, much safer bet, is probably the way to go.
I did not think you're going to be on that side. I thought you were going to call us crazy, Kate and I, for liking Bijan maybe. I'll still have CMC ranked 1. I will, because I'm too big of a baby. But Bijan, I could definitely see him getting really close.
Well, you had Bijan 1 last year. I distinctly remember.
This is my issue, right? So now I'm nervous. George Kittle, though, is a guy I've never really ranked all that high because he's highly inconsistent. Last year, he finishes the tight end 6 in fantasy points per game behind Kelsey, Hawkinson, Laporta, Ingram, and Andrews, and he had over 1,000 receiving yards. So to have over 1,000 receiving yards as a tight end is an elite season. Only 6 receiving touchdowns. That's really been his issue throughout his entire career. He had the one big year in 2022 with 11, and then it came back down to 6, which was his second best year and tied for second best year in receiving touchdowns. But 3 of them came in one game. So he had 3 touchdowns the rest of the year, and his fantasy points are all over the place because Kyle Shanahan does not utilize him regularly. He had 90 targets last year. That's the same amount as Cole Kmet. That's just 3 more than Tyler Conklin. Like, he is way too talented to only get that. But do you think Shanahan's ever going to utilize him more if this is just his role?
If Aiyuk isn't on the team next year, I think Kittle probably stands to benefit more than anyone else.
Okay.
But if anyone has ever heard any of my shows on the Gold Standard Podcast Network, blocking is the second best thing George Kittle does. Kyle Shanahan seems to be the only person that doesn't get that. Kittle is a phenomenal receiving tight end. He breaks tackles. He's still faster than most tight ends in the league, even though he's probably lost a little bit of a step. He ran a 4.5 40 when he came into the league. He is a beast. The only thing holding him back is usage. If he got targets like Travis Kelce gets targets in Kansas City, he would put up the exact same numbers. And in fact, if you go and look when he has gotten similar targets, he's put up similar production from Travis Kelce.
Not the touchdowns, but the receiving yards, yes.
George Kittle has the record for most receiving yards in a single season by a tight end. He broke it when he got the targets, and they didn't even have good quarterbacks that year. It was CJ Beathard and a pile of garbage in San Francisco that year. So if Kyle would use 85, he would produce. But the problem is when they have so many playmakers, like you said, Kyle will never force feed anybody. And so what you see with George Kittle is what you get.
So I think our conclusion is that Brock Purdy, great value in fantasy. Christian McCaffrey is still going to, I think we're still, the only way he's not elite is injury, right? I think that's our biggest worry. And then the pass catchers, there's too many of them. So we're kind of staying away from them in terms of their fantasy costs. But I do love Brock Purdy. I think he's going to be on a lot of my fantasy teams this year if his cost stays down. That is it for today's show. Thank you so much to Stats for joining us today. You can follow him at Stats on Fire on X or Twitter. Again, that's Rob Stats Guerrera. I don't call him Rob. He's Stats. Make sure to go listen to his shows at the Gold Standard Network. And if you enjoyed us together, we do a show every Friday that we'll be recording soon after this on the Gold Standard Network called The Gold Diggers. Thank you to you all for making Locked On Fantasy Football your first listen every day. Everydayers. I'll be back on Monday with Vinny talking more fantasy goodness. Don't miss it. Bye, y'all.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily